This is the I Read Comic Books podcast, the very best comic book podcast for regular comic book fans. I'm your host, Mike Rappin. Joining me this week, two aging jewel thieves back for their one last heist, Kate Scotchless
Hello.
and Paul Jasley.
Hello, humanoids.
The question of the day is, who gets crushed in the Batcave? I don't know. We'll find out. But before we get into what we're actually going to be talking about later in the episode, which is our Goodreads Book of the Month, Catwoman, Lonely City, I've got a couple of questions that I need to ask Kate and Paul. And one more announcement. We have a listener survey. You may have seen this posted on some of our socials. If you're on Discord, or if you're on the internet in general, maybe you're just tuned in and honed in on IRCB and you've seen this already. But if you haven't, there is a link to our annual IRCB listener survey where you can go and fill some things out. And if you give us your name and your email, I promise we're not using it for anything like that, at least not yet. I'll let you know if we do, because I'll send you an email. But if you do that, you could get entered to win a $25 gift certificate to Amazon or Midtown Comics, or donation to a charity of your choice if you want. Some folks asked for that last year, so we're doing it this year. But we just want to know what you think of the show, if you've got thoughts about things that we could improve on. And then we've got some extra questions about, like, a little bit more in-depth questions if you want to, but those are totally optional. And if you're a Patreon member, we've got an entire section about Patreon as well. So check that out in the show notes. I'm not going to say it out loud because you've already gotten so much spam. I imagine that AI is squeezing the life out of every single podcast and trying to steal things, so I'm not going to read out where it's at, but you can find that in the show notes. Good luck, Godspeed. Hopefully we can find your results in all of the spam. I'm going to go through everything. Don't worry about it. But anyways, we're here to talk about comic books, and I've got two legally mandated questions that I've got to ask, and that is, how have you been? How have comic books been? I'm going to kick this over to Paul to start things off. Welcome to 2024, by the way.
We're here. It's a brand new year. We're starting a clean slate. I'm going to really expand my horizons when it comes to comic books and what I read. So I'm here to talk about, an issue of Batman. I'm trying out this Batman title I've heard so much about.
Okay.
I'm jumping on with issue 140, or issue 905 for you legacy numbering freaks out there. And this is part of the current story being written by Chip Zdarsky, art by Jorge Jimenez, colors by Tomeu Morey, and letters obviously by Clayton Cowles, since it's a comic book coming out by one of the big two writers, so big two publishers.
Yeah.
And I'll admit, I'll come right out and say it. Apologies to Danny up front. I'm not really liking Zdarsky's Batman. It's not bad by any stretch of the imagination. It is a comic book that features Batman, and often he is punching people in the face, and that's always going to be something I enjoy. So that's not a complaint about, the overall comic itself. It's just, I feel like ever since Zdarsky took over, there's been a lot of references or callbacks to Grant Morrison's Batman run, which obviously I'm a huge fan of. Anyone that's listened to the Patreon series, A Better Batmobile, knows that is a Batman run that's near and dear to my heart. So at first I was really encouraged by the fact Zdarsky was referencing the Batman of Zur-En-Arrh, which is a huge part of Morrison's Batman, this sort of like backup personality that Bruce Wayne invented in case he ever failed. Batman would have this like backup, version of Batman without Bruce Wayne, and Zdarsky kind of took that concept and has kind of run with it for the past like couple story arcs here. And something about it, though, isn't clicking for me. And again, I don't think it's not a huge criticism, because I think it is interesting, but it doesn't feel like the same. What I liked about Morrison's run doesn't seem to be reflected here. And I remember when, I always say Zach instead of Scott Snyder took over Batman for New 52. That's right after Morrison's run. And one of the co-hosts on the much missed Wait What podcast made a comparison that if Morrison was writing a prog rock album, the Scott Snyder Batman was like the pop punk version of that. And I feel like that's kind of similar here, where it's like, if Morrison was doing a David Lynch film, Zdarsky's doing a Christopher Nolan film. And it's like, all right, it's high concept. There's a lot of action. There's things I like about it, but something's just not clicking for me. It doesn't seem to be as engaging to me as the Morrison stuff. So, anyway, this issue feels like kind of a culmination of some of the issues I've had with the series, which is why I want to talk about it. You have Batman fighting against Zur-En-Arrh, this other backup Batman who's come back, and apparently everyone knows about it now, because all the Robins and everyone else is like referencing this Zur, as they call it. It almost just feels like another Batman rather than a alternate personality backup, kind of like as Morrison wrote it. And the thing is, Zdarsky also did a whole like multiverse portion of the story a couple arcs ago. So it's like, don't just one Batman of Zur-En-Arrh, there's a whole multiverse worth of them. And in this issue, Batman is fighting the Joker at the same time fighting against versions of himself. And again, all of that is really interesting. Like, I love the multiverse. I love Batman of Zur-En-Arrh. I love the sort of concept. There's a lot of fan service of seeing Batman beat up other versions of Batman. Like, what's better than that? But somehow it's just not.
George Clooney just getting his ass kicked by a comic book Batman.
Yeah. And I think part of it does rub me as sort of fan service as a point, because there's a moment where you have the Batman that's basically the Michael Keaton Batman from the Tim Burton film, as Zur-En-Arrh with like the orange with the red and purple, costume gimmick. And Batman makes some like joke as he's beating him up, he makes some joke about, it's like, at least I can turn my head in my costume and stuff like that. So it's like, it's fun, but it's also not really like clicking for me in a way. I don't know.
Sure. It's like a little too meta for a comic book, which is ridiculous to say out loud that I even spoke those words.
Yeah.
But I understand what you're saying, where it's like a little bit too on the head when it comes to like just referencing shit about Batman, right? It's kind of, I don't know. Maybe is that kind of what you're getting at?
I think kind of, yeah. It's like, it is high concept in a way, but I think Morrison, again, I don't think Morrison is a subtle writer at all, but in their run, there was a sense of like, there's some deeper things you can dig out. And this is like almost all surface. You know what I mean? There's not this sort of like deeper analysis I can run of this stuff. I mean, overall, I do, again, it's all stuff I like. So I'm enjoying this series kind of just as a Batman fan, but it's not like clicking for me the way that some recent Batman runs have, even after Morrison.
Gotcha.
The one positive I will say is that Jorge Jimenez is one of my favorite current Batman artists. I think he's fantastic. So the books so far have looked great issue to issue, because I think he's a great artist, and the way he's able to kind of capture the different artistic styles, I'm always a sucker for that. So when you have the Batman of Zur-En-Arrh that's basically from Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns, it looks like it was drawn by Frank Miller, like stylistic stuff like that I always am a sucker for. So
yeah,
it is kind of frustrating. It's a Batman comic that I think is good. There's a lot of things I like about it, but somehow it's not clicking for me in the way that I was hoping it would. So I'm wondering if the next story arc, because it feels like this issue sets up like a sort of like end piece for what Zdarsky started with, the whole like fail-safe storyline. It's kind of like tying up some loose ends. So either like he's like, wrapping this run up, or he's going to shift to another story arc. I don't know. I'm still going to obviously buy Batman comics. I'm not giving up. So.
Right. This isn't finally pushing you off Batman comics, right?
No.
Okay.
No, again, it's still good, but it's not clicking for me in some ways.
Gotcha. Well, Kate, how about you? How have you been? How have comic books been?
I have been good. It has been disturbingly warm here, so enjoying not dying on icy roads, but also a little concerned about the planet. Otherwise, though, we did just finally get some snow. But what I've been reading has been honestly a bunch of books that you and Nick talked about from the last time I was on the show, because I sat here as you were talking and like put a bunch of books on hold from Melcat, our state's interlibrary loan system.
Nice.
And so the one that I just finished was Blue Book Volume 1, 1961 by James Tinian and Michael Avon Oeming that Nick talked about. And I'm sorry, Nick, this was not for me. So this is the story of Betty and Barney Hill's alleged alien abduction in 1961, which is notable, of course, because it's like the first quote unquote alien abduction claim. And it's the basics of the story minus the most interesting details, in my opinion. So like there's been so much analysis of this case for obvious reasons. And the main things that hypotheses are like the accidental awareness hypothesis of we now know that at the time, and it still happens now, but to a lesser degree, but at the time, people that underwent surgery were often having accidental awareness because they weren't using, because of the way they were using anesthesia cocktails at the time. They have since modified them. But they were waking up completely paralyzed and hazy with, beings hovering over them that you could only see their eyes and, all this stuff. And that's a key theory for, all these, when people went under hypnosis and then had memories of being on a table like this and, I was abducted. That was, experimented on. That's one of the key theories for that. And And then the whole interracial marriage anxiety hypothesis is a big one, about how this was an interracial couple in the 60s in a liberal area, but even liberal areas weren't exactly that liberal about it back then.
Sure.
And they also left out a lot of the relevant info as a way of making the story sound more plausible. So, like, they talk about the star chart that Betty drew and how Dr. Fish then was like, oh, verified it, that it matches up with these stars. But they leave out that Fish herself later rejected her own hypothesis about the star chart when we got improved star data available in the early 90s that showed it was completely wrong. Like, we just got better measurements because of a European satellite that went out, and they were like, yep, this is bunk. And then
and Dr. Fish is could you just explain who the character is? Just I don't remember this at all.
So
I'm totally blanking on this story.
Fish was like one of the scientists who, in reviewing Betty's story and looking at the star chart that she draws from memory, quote unquote, that she like lines it up and it's like, these are the stars it matches, and there's like no chance that this is fake because it's like a 1 in a million odds that she'd be able to draw this. And then at the time it's debunked by Carl Sagan in the 80s on Cosmos and stuff. But Fish was the vocal scientist being like, no, this is real. And it matches up with planets that could be habitable, and and the distances are right and stuff like that. And then more data comes out, better data comes out decades later. And she's like, never mind. That was totally wrong. Which, like, kudos to her for, like, some scientists really dig in instead of admitting they were wrong or whatever, but she retracted it. And they also leave out the similarity to the aliens they draw. So that one of the other notable firsts of this case is that it's the first time we get like what we now think of as the quintessential like gray alien look. The big head with big eyes and little dot nose and tiny mouth.
Yes.
And the important bit there is the Outer Limits show aired for the first time, an episode for the first time 12 days before the hypnosis session where they drew that with an alien that looks just like that. You're like, hang on. And then they also kind of touch on, but just barely, and don't go into the detail of why Betty was not considered credible by the UFO community itself. Like later in life, she goes full nutter. And like when you read more about that, it's like, oh wow, okay, these people were not credible for many reasons. There's many really good explanations for what they went through, and it's been like, yeah. So it's interesting in the sense that I like X-Files. I like reading these things. I've watched 10 million UFO documentaries, and I'm not proud. I find it fun, but that also means that I've seen so many tellings of this exact Betty and Barney Hill story, and it felt like it didn't really have anything to say about it. Like they just kind of go through the basics of the fact. They're not saying anything, having a particular take on it, and really not having much less anything new. You know what I mean?
Sure.
That was where I was kind of like, yeah, it was fine. I'm had fun reading it, but I'm not gonna be passing it out as like a here, you should check out this book to other alien nerds. If you're not familiar with the story, it is a fun case that you should read about. And if you do that via comics, that's great. There's also many other versions that you can go into. But yeah, that was the big thing for me. I do really like the art in it. They did a great job with that. And Tinian's writing is always great.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting because I kind of got that same feeling from the first, I think I read the first 2 issues. Like, as someone who had just recently listened to a podcast all about this. So I was like, oh, let's see what Tinian and Oming has to say about this. And like, it was kind of, I understand that like flatness. It kind of just feels like a retelling of the story. It would have been interesting to see like a narrative insertion almost to say like adding like little bits and pieces of commentary, but like it does just kind of feel like a retelling of the story, like without anything extra to it. So I totally see what you're saying.
Well, and I think part of that feeling pretty flat is that they do this in 5 issues, so they don't go into much depth. Which when you have entire books on a case, entire like 2-hour long podcast episodes and full length documentaries, it means you're inherently just going to get a lot less. But yeah, I think if you're not familiar with it already, this might be a much better read than what
Yeah,
I experienced. But otherwise,
right.
yeah. How about
Fair
you,
enough.
Mike?
Well, for me, I've been all right. I have been, trying to reassess myself in general in terms of like my comic reading habits in general. So as I said famously before we took our little bit of break where Paul and Kate and Zach had some fun little minisodes, I'm not going to be really buying any new comics this year for the most part.
How's that going,
Like
Mike?
on
How many
Wednesday I
comics have you
did
bought
go
this
and
year?
on Wednesday I did go buy new comics. Kate, let me fucking get
This is
there
Mhm.
first. But
for the listeners. This is January 6th. It's been 6 days.
yeah. Well, so here's the thing. Like I plan on keeping up with some of the ongoing books, and like I did try a new number one. I do want to talk about it in a second. But I am trying to just be a little bit more just like focused in my comic buying habits, right? Like last year, I bought a lot of comics for the sake of buying them. And
Mhm.
now like I have just bookshelves full of stuff. Like I'm not buying any new physical comics that I haven't already pre-ordered at my comic shop. Until I basically get through everything, right? I'm trying to be really just like intentional with everything that I'm doing this year. I'm trying to cut back a little bit on spending. I did some quick maths using a budgeting app at the end of this year, and the amount of money I spent on comics and comic related things would put people on the floor in need of medical attention. It's
Mhm.
surprising, myself included. I fell out of my chair after I saw it, so I was like, okay, maybe this year we can be a little less extra about comic books. So that being
Mhm.
said, I'm digging through a lot of my comic. I hope everyone on the show and off the show, if you're listening to the show, keeps me honest about my bullshit. But yeah, I did read a comic book that I've been sitting on for a little while that I got from a Kickstarter. This is A Frog in the Fall by Leanna Sturt. You may have heard me talk about this artist slash writer. She's an all-in-one creator before. She did another book called Stages of Rot, and that was a book about like a mythical fantasy world where this flying whale falls to the ground. It's like a whale fall in the ocean. It kind of changes the ecology. But what about this fantasy world when that happens? It's very cool. But A Frog in the Fall is a very different book. It's got the chillest vibes I've ever had in a comic book that I can think of. It's about a little frog who just wants to go on a quick little, just like leisurely adventure with two vagabonds who are traveling across the countryside to try to get to the quote unquote tropical area. There's a tropical island, and I'm putting in heavy quotes here, and they're just trying to go south to avoid the winter. And this little frog's like, well, I'll travel with you guys for a couple of days, and they're like, cool, dude, just make sure you can feed yourself. We'll work on that together. And they go on this little, just very nice trip. Like they're just little frog-sized dudes wearing like these old Japanese like Edo style clothing, and they're clearly traveling through parts of Japan. They come across like the living spirit of a plum tree. They come across a dog who's guarding a garden, and they steal a giant melon, and it's this food that they can eat for like 4 days straight. They get to a beach town where it's all run by cats. But they do encounter like human things. They encounter a car that's driving over a road that they have to run across, and it's super cute. It's probably one of the like chillest books that I've read in a long time that is also funny and entertaining. And I mean, Sturt's art is unbelievably beautiful. Like I can't express how much I just want to rip all the pages out of this book and just put it on my wall because they're so fantastic. And
Mhm.
I feel like I say that about a lot of books, but I think if you saw this book in person, you would understand that there are just pages in this book that don't need to be in the comic. They're just beautiful renditions of art from a unique angle and perspective. And Sturt's art is just fantastic. Apparently, she did the whole book using this very old pen, like I think it was a calligraphy pen or something like that she was gifted by her grandfather who passed away recently, or at least before the book started. And it's so interesting to see how that type of art style in general, like just using inks for everything, can really change like pages and the way that dialogue is done, because even the dialogue is all handwritten, I think, for the most part. So yeah, it's a really cool book. And the one thing I'll say is this book is in widescreen, like, and I say that because the entire book it's as wide as that Panel Syndicate book, that Private Eye book that Brian K.
Mhm.
Vaughan did or whatever. But it doesn't have a backing cover. So like the front page and the last page are like thicker cardboard, but you open
Oh.
it up and you're supposed to be able to open it up all the way flat. So there is no like spine to it. So when you open it up, it's like this giant full length page that's maybe a foot and a half wide when you fully open it up. So it's really cool the way that she plays with perspective on the page, where a character on the far left of the page will talk to a character on the far right, and then there will be these bubbles that are kind of in the middle of the two pages. It's so wonderfully done. It's such a unique way to take that specific page layout, and rather than just having panels, like every single page is just like a chunk of the story. There are very few panels in this book, which means that it's really thick and it's very quick to read at the same time. So if you can get your hands on this book, unfortunately, the publishing studio that made this book, PEOW, is out of business now. They closed up shop, and so getting a physical copy of this book is very hard. However, there are digital copies still available, and there are some comic shops that you can find online that are selling this book for average for the market price. So if you're interested in getting a very unique, very cool looking book, highly recommend A Frog in the Fall. It's so, I don't know, it's so pleasant. That's the only way I can describe it. It's just a beautiful book. Sturt, I think in her previous work, did a lot of work trying to try to just show cool nature shit, and that is exactly what this book is, right? Like Stages of Rot was just her like, I want to draw some cool flowers, so this next two pages are just cool flowers, and that's literally what happens in this book. It's like sometimes, oh, I just want to draw this tree hanging and has snow on it, just cuz, and there's maybe not really relevant to the story, it's just kind of there. And it's beautiful. She clearly has like a love for drawing real life things. Like the frogs are really cool looking throughout the book, the cats are really nice and all that. But like when she focuses on different pieces of nature, it's like, this took you days and it's just a page in this book. Like I'm so in love with it. It's fantastic.
Interesting.
So that's what I've been up to. But Paul, why don't you tell us about one more book before I jump into one more as well?
Well, I have to issue another apology to Danny personally, since this book technically isn't a comic. It's a collection of essays, but it's comic book adjacent, and I'm really enjoying it. I want to talk about it on the show. So
okay, all right. Well, Danny, we know you hate prose, but this has to happen. I'm letting Paul do this. I'm sorry.
Thank you. I'm granted immunity for the next few minutes here.
Yeah.
No, I got this for Christmas, and I've been reading through it, and it's really great. It's called I Am the Law: How Judge Dredd Predicted Our Future. It's by Michael Molker, who used to work for 2000 AD. I think he was a publicist or editor in some capacity there for a while. And again, it's technically not a comic. It's a collection of essays that Molker has written about the history of Judge Dredd, but using that as a way to talk about the very real issues and problems with modern policing. So it's an interesting approach to the material, because it's the idea that Judge Dredd as a character and Judge Dredd as a comic strip has never really been about science fiction or a speculative future. It's always reflected the times in which it was written. So the character was first introduced during the beginning of the Margaret Thatcher era in England. And there was a big change in the way people were policed and the way that the government used the police force in Britain at that time. So over the years, and the book is kind of organized roughly chronologically, the way that Dredd has changed over time, or the different stories that he highlights, reflect different issues about policing as policing has changed since the 1970s and even prior to that. So I think it's a way to engage with really heavy, serious topics like, stop and seizure, or what do you call it? Stop and search,
Stop and frisk.
Issues like that. Stop and frisk, yes. Like that. Issues of surveillance, issues of, race when it comes to policing. All of them, Molker is able to find an analogous Judge Dredd story. And it's kind of chilling, because Dredd has always been this sort of like darkly humor satire of modern policing, but it's almost too real. It's like Judge Dredd it's sometimes not as extreme as real world policies are in some regards. Another thing I really appreciate about the book is that Molker is primarily writing about the history of British policing. Obviously, he references very famous American cases. He references the killing of Eric Garner and Michael Brown. There's issues of police brutality in the United States, but most of it is about the history of the use of the police force in England specifically. So it's kind of like a weird alternate history. It's very similar to America, but it's slightly different. And he highlights a lot of riots and a lot of police brutality cases that I'd never heard of. And so I think it's a really engaging book in that regard. And, it seems on one hand kind of like silly to reduce very serious real world topics to just like, this satirical comic. But I think Molker does a really good case of showing how important satire and the type of critiquing that Dredd is able to do, that John Wagner and Alan Grant were able to do in the 70s and 80s, to highlight these issues. So even if you're a reader as a kid who's not aware of these things, you're reading Judge Dredd, you might start to notice those issues in your real life, as you get older. And I think that's what makes the book so compelling. So I'm reading through it. I'm really engaged. Obviously, I love Judge Dredd. He's referencing a lot of stories that I've read, and it makes a heavy topic almost more palpable, in a way.
Interesting.
Because just reading reports about police brutality is pretty tough. But if you can kind of balance it out by some of the more humorous Dredd stories, but still show why that's important and how satire can be in a reflection of society, it's really fascinating. And the other benefit is that you don't really have to know anything about Judge Dredd, because the first chapter basically gives you history of the character and a history of 2000 AD as a comic. So you can jump right in, and you can just start your own Judge Dredd reading list. You can start digging in and finding the stories that Molker references. So again, technically not a comic, but comic adjacent, and a book that I'm really enjoying. And I definitely highly recommend, if you want to read something that can be a little heavy and disturbing at times, but is a really well written and really fascinating, and a great introduction to Dredd as well. It's I Am the Law: How Judge Dredd Predicted Our Future. So highly recommend it.
Nice. Yeah, this sounds fascinating. I think every once in a while, and maybe more often than once in a while, we probably need books like this that remind us of the importance of satire and how satire is used, because I think a lot of the times people don't really understand how satire works, right? They're like, no, it's I get to say this bad thing because it's satire. It's like, but I don't actually. Hold on, I don't think you know what this is. So it's good to see that someone
all the Punisher bumper stickers.
Right.
Well, yeah. Yeah, so it's interesting to see someone like Michael Molker writing a book like this to explain the importance of a character like Dredd in the way that satire is used in order to tell us, to comment on things that are happening in the real world. So you've sold me, Paul. I'm going to read a book this year.
A real book, quote unquote real book. Yeah.
Real prose book. Well, let me talk about one more book really quick before we get into the top of our pile. I read Pine and Merrimac #1. This is by Kyle Starks and Fran Galan. The story is Linnea Kent is a woman who's seen the worst in the world. Her sister was kidnapped and killed when she was a child, and Linnea has set her life solving problems for other people as a private detective, mostly unloyal spouses and the occasional strange occurrence. Her husband is the strongest guy around, a former boxer turned absolute sweetheart. He and Linnea are deeply in love, and it's extremely corny. One day, when a young girl who looks similar to Linnea's sister is kidnapped, Linnea puts aside her aversion to darker investigations and decides this is her case to solve. There's a bit about Linnea trying to be a homicide police detective, and it didn't work out. She just couldn't put her history past some of the harsh things she was seeing. But this book is it's a great mix of corny, funny, and action-packed panels. If you've ever read Kyle Starks, you kind of know he's always bringing a bit of comedy to whatever he's writing. This book seems to be a really good mix of action and really corny scenes between two people who are really in love, to the point where I was like, is this a bit? And it's like, no, that's how he's writing these people, and it's kind of cute. And there's some good action as well. And I think most of that action and a lot of the comedic timing is not due to the writing, but to Fran Galan's art. This book is if you look this artist up, you'll see that they do incredible painted pages. And I don't know if this is digital or actual painted art, but man, oh man, every single page is jam packed with color and richness, and all of the panels are perfectly placed in order to time things out with the lettering. It's a really, really fun book to just look at. It's a really beautiful book, and then it's also funny, and it's got a lot of fun action. The color work on this book is impeccable. I don't know if there was a colorist on this book. I couldn't find the information. Why isn't there a universal database out there like Comic Book DB? But anyways, this book is really great. I think if you're looking for a fun little action detective story, this is really fun. I'm really excited to see what Starks does with this book. This is one of those books where I said, all right, I'm intentionally spending my time trying to find a book that I think I'm going to enjoy, and I'm making harsh decisions on, if I don't like #1, I'm not going to just try #2. If you haven't sold me, I'm fucking out. So this book sold me. I'm going to try #2. And again, if #2 doesn't work, I'm fucking out. That's my new spiel this year, is if that didn't work, I'm out. I'm done. I'll put that on a t-shirt for episode 400. But Anyways, let's talk about comics on the top of our pile. These are new comics, old comics. If you've been here before, you know what we're all about. If not, we're talking about comics, baby. But before we get into that, I want to shout out some of the folks hanging out with us on Discord. They're reading some books, and this is on the top of their pile. Danny's reading Rebel Moon, Houses of Blood Axe #1. Who reads movie tie-ins these days? I don't know. Hugh is reading Rise of the Powers of X #1. And Paul G is finally reading Where the Body Was. That's a fantastic book, Paul. I can't wait for you to love it. But I guess, Kate, let me pitch things back over to you. What is on the top of your pile this week?
The top of my pile is a book big enough to kill a cat or small dog, the Planetary Omnibus hardcover, which
God.
I
Wow.
just grabbed from my library. This is by Warren Ellis and John Cassidy. I don't know why publishers make books this size. This is like, there's a very good chance I'm going to give up and just get it from Hoopla or something if I can find a digital copy of volume 1, because it is like almost unreadably huge. But on that end, I am feeling very sci-fi because I recently discovered, and by discovered, I mean it's been on my list for many years because of Xander, The Expanse, and have gone so hard and deep on this over Christmas break and just want more sci-fi in my life. And I'm not positive how sci-fi Planetary is, but it involves space, and my library's collection is not that big. So
Okay.
so the basics of this are there's 3 people that are tracking down evidence of superhuman activity in the late 20th century. They're archaeologists of a sort, and uncovering unknown paranormal secrets and histories, such as a World War II supercomputer that can access other universes, a ghostly spirit of vengeance, and a lost island of dying monsters. Sounds like it might be more cape flavor than sci-fi flavor, but again, I have like 2 or 3 shelves of comics for adult comics at my library. Yay, rural living. So they spent a lot of money on this omnibus, I'm sure. So we'll check it out.
Yeah. I was gonna say, if I feel like this book definitely leads more pulp comics than it does sci-fi.
Okay.
That being said, I think there's a lot of really cool like sci-fi shit in this book. Having read it, I read it a couple years ago, and yeah, it's got some really cool bits in it. I think I like the way that all of the characters get developed. The mystery box that is Box as a character gets unfolded in a really interesting way, and I think by the end, I felt pretty satisfied with the end of it. There is also a crossover which might be included in this omnibus with the Justice League, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
So I'd be curious to see what you think about it, Kate, because I do think like. Go ahead.
Didn't Warren Ellis write Trees?
Yes.
Okay, so I really like Trees. I hope that this is written as well, because that had a cool mystery to it.
Yeah. I mean, the one little asterisk that I will just put on this book as far as recommendations go is like Warren Ellis, not so great of a guy. So just for anyone out there, look up Warren Ellis allegations. That's all I'll say. That being said, though, this book is a pretty interesting story. I do like I said, the development of the characters is very cool in a way that like feels like classic hard sci-fi. But it's all about comic book characters in a way. Like, I think there's some afterwards and some other things I've read about the book where there are references to things that are like deep in pulp comic book and story or pulp literature, like history, but it's not necessary to know to enjoy this book. So curious to hear what you think at the end, okay? Because it's a big old book, as you said. It's literally like a beefy beast. So
did you read the whole series?
I think I read everything but the crossover that they did. So
okay.
But it's a fast read too. I mean, like it's dense, but I think it's a pretty fast read. It's like 4 or 5 volumes total. Well, let me talk about a book that it's on the top of my pile as I'm going through my giant bookshelf. That book that I read by Linnea Sturt came from a Kickstarter. This next book also came from a Kickstarter. This is Ruination Volume 1, written by Ryan Biss, art by Sarah Fletcher, Elizabeth McKenzie, and Julia Lally, colors by Katie Brown, letters by Matthias Zanetti. The simple pitch of this book: soldiers embark on an adventure filled with magic crystals, secret wars, and portals to strange post-apocalyptic worlds. I mean, come on. Doesn't that have everything that everyone wants in a comic book? There was a bigger, better pitch, I think, for the entire first issue that got me hooked, because I backed the first few issues, and now I'm looking at my digital folder of things. I backed all 6 issues on Kickstarter digitally, but I figured I'd get the physical edition of this book because I did really like the first 2 issues that I read. I have a terrible habit of backing things on Kickstarter and then completely forgetting to read them, but I just want to support indie comics, okay? But anyways, the book was a little complicated in terms that it has a lot of lore, and I feel like reading a single issue every 3 or 4 or 5 months is kind of hard when you've got a big lore. So I was excited to get the collection of this so that I can sit down and actually give it its due time to read through, absorb everything, and be fully invested in the universe. So I'm very excited to sit down with that. I got the nice hardcover edition of this late last year, and so I'm excited. It's sitting on my bookshelf just over to my right here, but it should be fun. High fantasy magic shit that I really like, so I'm hyped to actually sit down and dig into this. Paul, this is totally up your alley, right?
Oh yeah, sounds like the kind of things I like all the time. Space, magic, crystals. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, tell us about what's on the top of your pile before we go into our break.
Well, it's funny. Speaking of something that I really kind of is way out of my wheelhouse that I don't know much about, the book I'm excited about is Deep Cuts #4, which is about jazz. And I'm too dumb to get jazz, but I really like this book a lot. This is #4 of a 6-issue miniseries that Image is publishing. It's written by Joe Clark and Kyle Higgins. This issue has art by Ramon K. Perez. And it's funny, I thought I had missed a few issues of this because the last issue #3, came out back in July. So I thought,
wow.
I missed it. I'll just have to grab the collection. But I saw it was on the list coming up this week in the shop. So I was like, oh, maybe it just got delayed for whatever reason. But it's a really interesting series. Each issue is kind of like a standalone story that takes place in a different era of jazz history. And, Joe Clark and Kyle Higgins do a lot of research and kind of recreate this style of jazz is being played at a certain time. So the first issue is set in 1917. You get the sort of ragtime jazz era stuff. Then it'll go on to the 1930s and 40s. And this issue is set in the 1950s in New York and the start of bebop and hard bop jazz, which, again, I took a jazz history class in college, so I know the terms, but as far as listening to it, it's so not my thing. But I think what's great is that each issue isn't really about the music itself. I mean, it's a celebration of jazz as an art form, but there's a very unique emotional story to each issue, and they're all standalone different stories. So it's like a collection, it's like an anthology kind of. And this issue is about, an ex-con who gets out of prison, a former band leader, and he's trying to get his band back together and his life back together at the same time in 1950s New York. So it's an engaging emotional story as well as being a reflection of, a certain era of American musical history. So even if you're not into jazz like me, there's still something in the story that'll really grab your attention. And what I like is that attention to detail that Clark and Higgins bring to each story. So you really get a sense of that, even if, again, it's a silent comic, you can't hear the music, but the imagery, the style of the pages, the artwork, it all kind of makes you sort of feel what that era is like. And you kind of get a sense of what the music meant to people at that time in history. And then each issue, they hire a jazz musician to write a little musical piece. So there's a 1 page in the back of the issue that is musical notation, that's written to fit the comic. And it's boy, I kind of wish I learned how to read music so I know what that is. It looks cool, but I imagine at some point someone's gonna have to do a playlist or something, or maybe someone will play those pieces to kind of see what they sound like. But it's a really interesting series. This Deep Cuts, this is the 4th issue out of 6. So if you're not picking it up or you missed a few, definitely worth checking it out in trade when it eventually comes out, because it's really fun.
Nice. Well, 2024, Paul, now it's time to start learning an instrument, and you could learn that music, and you could be the person that puts the video up on the IRCB channel that's like, hey, Kyle Higgins and Ramon K. Perez and Joe Clark, look what I did. And they'll go, yeah, nice try, bud.
How does it sound on kazoo? Yeah, exactly.
I love it. I figured you'd pick up clarinet or something like that, but let's talk about that in the break. We're going to take a quick break here. When we come back, we're going to be talking about our Goodreads Book of the Month as picked by the wonderful people over on Goodreads who finished our 2023 reading challenge, Catwoman, Lonely City. We'll be back in just a second. our show this week, as I said, we are talking about the Goodreads Book of the Month. We used to do Goodreads Book of the Month episodes every month, and we started to scale it back, and now we're bringing it back once a year just for the Goodreads Reading Challenge finishers of the previous year. So every January, we're going to be talking about books. Listen to this podcast for decades, please. But folks that finished our Goodreads Challenge last year voted and had a conversation on Goodreads to figure out a book that we should read and talk about on the show, and they picked Catwoman, Lonely City. This is by Cliff Chiang from DC Comics, the Black Label book. So it's that extra wide format. It looks really, really nice as a hardcover. In my opinion, it's very annoying as single issues, but that's just me. Totally not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about the book. So I guess, Paul, Kate, do either of you have like a quick summary of this book? Otherwise, I can read the official one, but I don't know if either of you had a quick summary off the top of your head.
So this is an example of what DC likes to do sometimes, where so you have an alternate future for characters. It's set in the future, 10 years after Batman has died fighting against the Joker in something called Fool's Night that they talk about. And we get to see Selina Kyle, Catwoman, who is wrongly arrested under the assumption that she'd killed Batman, out from prison and attempting to recover something from the Batcave, pulling one last heist. And along the way, she has to put a team together and fight against basically the new mayor of Gotham City, one Harvey Dent, who has taken Batman's legacy and iconography and used to create a police state in Gotham. And that's basically like a short version of the story. So you get over the course of 4 issues, we get to see what Selina Kyle's like looking for, what happened to Batman that night when he passed away, and what Batman's legacy is in Gotham City to these characters. So it's a fun alternate future for the Gotham City Batman related characters.
Yeah. And I think from here on out, we're going to just throw out the big spoiler warning. We're going to be talking about this whole book. I mean, no, Paul, I don't think you really spoiled anything at all. So but just throwing it out there, we're going to be talking about who lives, who dies, who lives on to see the future of Gotham. Because boy, oh boy, does it go all over the place. Characters die that I never would have thought would have happened, and characters live who I thought never would happen. So, I don't know, this book to me, first thing, Brian in the chat said this, he's also proof listening here, but Brian said one last heist is like a trigger phase to me. Like, I'm in, I don't care what else is happening. I felt the same way as soon as this book said Selina's out of jail and she's got to do one last, I'm like, hell yeah, I'm in. This is what sold me on the Rogues book that came out. Like, all the old Flash villains get together to do one last heist. Like, you got me. I don't even care what this book is. Like, I'm going to read this freaking thing. So, I was hooked immediately. Like, one, Cliff Chiang's art is absolutely beautiful, just so fun and vibrant from the get-go. And then it turns out that he wanted to just flex on us this entire book, right? Where he said, I'm going to show everybody in the coolest outfits. And it's not even like everyone's going to look hot, right? There's this thing I think with some artists where they show up to a book and you go, oh my god, everyone's beautiful. I'm feeling things about images on a page that I never thought I'd feel in my body before. Cliff Chiang,
Killer Croc has awakened something in me.
Listen, hey, I was getting there. Let me build, okay? Cliff Chiang instead goes. Cliff Chiang says, I love all of these characters and I want them to look cool as hell from start to finish. Everybody's going to look dope, whether you're the supervillain or you're the good guy or whatever in this book. You're going to look cool and you're going to look dope and you're going to look comfy. Selina's look throughout this whole book was just like comfortable and athletic at the same time, but not athleisure, right? Like she was in full tights, but then she'd wear this big ass sweatshirt. And I'm like, that is the coolest look that I wish that I could pull off, right? And everybody in this book pulls it off. I just love that. That's like one of the big things for me in this book. I don't know if you guys noticed that throughout, but like the black, like all the custom logos that people were wearing and stuff for the various superheroes, so cool. Like the shirt that gets me every time is the Black Adam shirt that we see on what's her name's nephew who ends up working with Selina. It says like black across the top and Adam upside down. I'm like, that's simple and I love it. I love the way that looks. Why is DC not just hiring Cliff Chiang to make merch for them? This is brilliant.
For real.
Yeah. I mean, I put that in my notes here. Is there any like contemporary superhero artist that does fashion and style better than Cliff Chiang? Like, it's like every artist that's drawing should like take a semester and take a class in fashion drawing, and like that's what we come up with, because everyone like looks great and everyone has their own unique style. Not everyone looks the same. Like, they wear different clothes, they're different body shapes, and their clothes actually fit their body shapes. Nothing's like skin tight unless it's Catwoman suit and stuff. So the way that he's able to draw clothes and do that, it's definitely something I noticed when I was reading this series.
Yeah. I think it's like between like other than Cliff Chiang, the only other artists that I think do this to a point where I notice it is like Jamie McKelvey and
Yep.
Right.
Chris Anka,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yep.
Both
Yeah.
of those artists, especially Anka, who was like during their Runaway work that they did with Rainbow Rowell, like would have pages in the back. They're just like, yeah, these are the outfits that I wanted you. Like, this is my art board that I drew for myself to know what these characters look like in their clothes in different ways. And this is what I did for this issue. Here's what I did for this issue. Like every single issue was a new set of outfits that he was focusing on for those characters. And I have to imagine Chang did the exact same thing in this book, right? Where like each issue, everyone's in their own different things, especially when they're changing outfits throughout the book. Like at one point, Selena has to like wear a costume, like as a costume person, not as like Catwoman. And
Mhm.
like her look totally drastically changes as she has to run out of this bar. And I'm like, that is attention to detail that like you could have just had her take off a wig, and instead it's like her whole demeanor changes when she walks outside. Like those little details sell this book in a way that like puts it above the others in like other really really good Batman offshoot books. That
Mhm.
this is going to stand the test of time, I think, because of these little attentions to detail. I can't stop gushing about this art. Someone please take this away from me. um yeah, I don't know, Kate, did you have any other thoughts about the art before we completely move on? I want to make sure you get your 2 cents in here too.
I mean, it's beautiful, and it reminded me why I really need to finish Paper Girls, because that's one of those series that I read the first, like,
Yeah.
2 volumes of, and then
Mhm.
would have needed to reread it by the time the next volume came out, and then never got around
Hmm.
to that. And yeah, it just really consistently one of the top artists in comics right now.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
absolutely, absolutely.
I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the coloring, because I think that's what works in so much of Chang's work
Oh,
is
Oh,
yeah.
yeah.
the way that the colors are used, complementary colors, colors that clash. He understands color theory in this amazing way. And like there are flashback sequences that are colored differently. And it's just so beautiful. It's one of those comics that I have to slow down when I'm reading it just to kind of absorb every panel and every
Hmm.
detail,
Mhm.
which makes, that's a sign of a good comic when you just want to get every little last drop of it, while you're
Hmm.
reading it.
Yeah, and it really does that thing that I think are unique to Chang's books, where there's like a hyper neon, or I don't even want to say neon
Mhm.
because the book isn't neon, right? Paper Girls is more of a neon book, but this
Yeah.
has
Mhm.
like such a hyper range of comic or colors as the like from page to page, from chapter to chapter, scene to scene, that are like the color is used to draw your attention to things, right? Some artists do like very clever like panel inserts, or they'll do like other clever things to circle you through the page, right? Like there's that there's the page that Elsa Chartier did, I don't know, on her YouTube channel a while back, where she talks about the way that David Aja guides your eye through action to get you from
Mhm.
one point of the page to the other. And Chang definitely does that, but I think like he highlights things in color in a way that like almost it's like when you stare at a light for too long, or you get like a flash of a shape, it like sticks with your in your mind for a second and really
Yeah.
carries you through whatever he's trying to tell you with just the art. And this book does that fantastically. I think he's done it in other books, but I really love how it's done with all the superhero symbolism throughout this
Mhm.
book. It's really really cool. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, let's move on. We can talk about the art, I guess, more, but I really want to talk about other pieces of this book. What
Yeah.
was like your favorite moment of this book? I mean, we know that there's a big heist and we lose people and all these other things happen. What was your favorite moment in this book as you were reading it? Kate, did you have a favorite moment?
Oh my god. All of the stuff with her meeting up originally with Killer Croc, and then him being like, "Hey, by the way, do you have like a couch I could crash on?" And like the whole
Yes.
training
Yeah.
montages of them getting back in shape, and him being
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
"I
yeah.
want bacon." And she's like, "You got to be fighting weight." Oh my god, I never thought I'd have feelings for Killer Croc, like feel
I
sad or
know.
happy about him. Oh my
Yeah,
god. The whole aged villains angle is just so good. And we never get stories
Yeah.
about badass older women in comics. Like
yeah,
she
yeah.
has wrinkles and she's kicking butt. It's fantastic.
Hmm. Yep. I
Yeah.
totally agree. I just, that again, part of the one last heist is getting the old gang back together. And like the way that
Yeah.
Chang does that when Selena has to recruit a Killer Croc and the Riddler, and the whole Riddler story, I like that Chang never like really gives you all the details. He's able to hint at, something where like Catwoman and the Riddler are catching up over dinner, over drinks, and they're kind of like teasing each other a little bit. You get snippets of the conversation, and like Selena's like, "Well, what about when you were wearing that that unitard and holding the cane?" And you get like one panel of like when they're doing the Jim Carrey like pose. And he says, well, I was doing a lot of cocaine at the time. I was like, well, yeah, that makes so much sense. Like, I just like how blunt that is, and but you get the story, the arc where he kind of hints at like, I've cleaned up my act, I'm a better person now. So it's, again, not just the villains didn't stay who they were, they changed over time, and it's like to see how they changed. That was interesting. So I do think the Killer Croc stuff really surprised me how much I enjoyed that.
He has that old man, what is that called? Like a page boy hat on. Speaking of like the just fantastic fashion, it just sells it so well. Because how do you make Killer Croc look like an old man? But it's the outfit. It's so perfect.
Yeah. Well, it's great. Like it's paired, like he's wearing that newsy hat, and then he's also like wearing like a jersey. He looks like a street tough, right? Like out of like a British like drama or something like that, like a guy who's been at this bar for 40 years, and he's been the same guy since he was 22 years old. And like he's aged, but like because he put on some weight, but he's still that guy, but he's clearly like an older man. Like it's I understand what you're getting at, because like that hat could be worn by a younger person, but the way that it sits with Croc, it's like no, he's just an old guy at this bar. It's so good.
Yeah, and that makes the sacrifice that Killer Croc makes later in the story hit so much harder. It's like you've kind of seen a character that, for me, like as much as I love Batman and all the Rogues Gallery, he's kind of been there. Like I don't have an opinion about Killer Croc really, but this story was really great. But if you're asking my favorite moment, and I'm very curious to hear your thoughts, both your thoughts on this, because as a deep DC fan, there are a lot of like cool little like Easter eggs and call outs, and I always wonder if that stuff is annoying to people that don't know it or if they didn't notice it. But one of the deepest cuts is toward the end of the story where Selina recruits Jason Blood, who of course is Etrigan the Demon, who is like kind of like a deep cut C-list DC character. So you get some magic involved with the demon, and then there's a little showdown between the demon and Clarion the Witch Boy, who's even deeper cut. I mean, that's from you're talking some like Jack Kirby early 70s DC deep cut characters, and for me, that's the shit I love. Like, I can't believe reading a Batman comic and my favorite moment is seeing the demon and Clarion fight. So I wonder if either of you had those sort of like moments like, okay, I don't know enough about DC, I'm not sure what this is, or was it distracting at all?
Well, I have a bit about this, but Kate, I really want to hear your thoughts, because you called yourself out in our notes as like not really a DC person. So
I'm
like
not,
what was going through your mind as you saw that?
So I gotta say, I am not a DC person, and on the rare occasion I read DC, I'm not a Batman person. So I think like the last Batman book I read was when Tom King's Volume 1 Batman story came out. And so that was, 2017, I think. So
maybe.
Yeah, it's been a minute. And I found this really easy to follow. I am positive that I missed lots of Easter eggs. But that is okay, because when this got voted on as the book, I was like, this is going to be fine, but not fun, because I don't know the background, all that stuff. And I found it really easy to follow, and I understood who everyone was. They do a really good job of giving you the context in a way that doesn't feel like they're feeding you the context, if you know what I mean.
Sure. Right. Yeah.
But they are giving it in often through dialogue of like, oh, remember that time when? And I'm like, I don't, but thanks for telling me.
Yeah. But did you, I guess, like when it comes to those moments though, with Etrigan and Witch Boy or Witch Man, did you find that like off-putting, or were you able to just roll with that at this point?
I just rolled with it. Like, I had never seen either one of those characters before, but they made it clear that they had a history between the two and what they did, like what their powers were and stuff. And I think the main thing so far as we talk that I realized that I completely missed was I didn't realize this is an alternate history spinoff. I thought this was part of the main. I'm like, I didn't know Batman died. When did that happen?
Oh man. Oh, a lot of changes in DC Comics continuity recently.
Yeah, something I really like is that, again, being a deep DC fan, and that's always been a part of DC's history, is doing these sort of like alternate futures and alternate histories of
Yeah.
characters to kind of see, you know, different versions. And again, I love that shit. So, you know, the
Yeah.
idea that Harvey Dent is mayor and then we get, you know, Barbara Gordon, you know, is, you know, running against him, like that's all the stuff that they could never do maybe in like the mainstream Batman story. Obviously you couldn't
Right.
kill Batman. So to have them be able to tell these type of stories and give it to an artist to take it and run with it to the way that Chang does,
Yeah.
I mean, I think I did pick this as my favorite book of last year or
Yeah.
2020. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
I ended up making this my favorite of the year.
Did you see that there's a beautiful, beautiful special edition hardcover copy version of this, Paul? Not to ruin your budget, but
no, and I have the single issues but that would look nice on my bookshelf. So yeah, I'm gonna have to pick that up at some point.
Paul, going back to what you said about this, like this alternate history, like alternate universe thing, like it is a DC classic. The thing that I find most interesting about this story is that none of it feels impossible. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like this history, the future that we're presented with is Catwoman as this older woman, Harvey Dent is mayor, Barbara Gordon running for things, like the Wayne Manor just like kind of running on this, like it's still got its all security measures and all this stuff. Like all of that to me seems plausible, right? Like there's something about the way that Ching tells this story where you're like, yeah, of course all this makes sense. Of course there was a giant war. Of course Batman died sacrificing himself. Finally it happened. We get to see this little story, like glimpse into this possible future because of a thing that's been hinted at so many times in Batman comics for decades. Finally happened. What happens following that path? And nothing feels like so bonkers, right? Harvey Dent becoming mayor kind of makes sense based on who Harvey Dent is as a character, right?
Yeah.
Sure, we have to deal with the supervillain thing, but I think the way that Chang twists the character's motive to say, like, I had to deal with my past and I'm using it to make Gotham great, like, I really like that because it doesn't feel like too far of a stretch, right? The fact that super or capes are outlawed in the city, and Barbara Gordon talks openly about how she and Harvey used to have these colorful pasts. Like I love all of that because it means that this is a thing for the people of Gotham that is understood. It's a thing for like us as the reader to be like it like grounds all of these characters in a way that you go, I think if someone, given the fantastical world of Gotham City, like if someone tried to come out and tried to own that rather than saying like, oh, that's all behind me, I'm never going to think about it or talk about it. Instead, they're like, no, I was Batwoman and now I'm here to try to represent you because I know Gotham in a way that maybe people don't like. That all clicks for me in the context of like the DC universe. And I love that how grounded this felt in like DC reality in some ways, where like nothing was so much of a true like stretch, right? Like if it was the Joker who was the head of Gotham City and then the Scarecrow was running Arkham Asylum, like that to me is like wackadoodle nonsense. What if bullshit, right? This book feels like the way that what I've always appreciated about DC alternate timelines is that it feels grounded in its own bullshit, whereas Marvel just goes like, what if X-Men were actually Avengers and the Avengers were naturally occurring beings? It's like, that's stupid, but I guess I'll buy this for $9.75 a fucking issue, for 5 issues. So anyways, rant aside, I do like how like weirdly grounded this whole book feels like in the bullshit of the DC universe. So I feel like Chang gives us details through very nice subtle context clues and story pieces, and some of it's a little ham-fisted, but like on the whole it works really, really well to add all of this like groundwork for him to finally get to this final crescendo of the end of the story.
Right. And I like that you put it that way because, the idea of like it taking place in the DC universe, it's not isolated just to Gotham, where it's like, it's a story about Gotham, it's about Batman, but it's like, yes, the Green Lantern, not the Hal Jordan one, but the, the older one, he exists and we found his ring. And then like, they able to use that. And again, the being able to like, if I'm going to break into the Batcave, why don't I get a literal demon to help me? It's like stuff like that. It's like when you put yourself in the DC universe, like, of course that all that stuff exists.
Right.
So, and also I like the idea that it's only 10 years into the future. So again, we're not talking this huge leap. So it does feel a very natural progression. So everything feels very grounded, like you said, and natural, and kind of makes sense that that's where everyone ended up.
The one thing I will say is the Etrigan Witch Boy thing did catch me a little off guard because I was like, who is this fancy man they're talking to? I genuinely thought they went and like talked to Lex Luthor or something at first, but then the guy was speaking all funky. I was like, is there like a British Batman? Is this Knight and Squire or something? And the fact that it's Etrigan, a character I only know because I did a lot of moderation on the comic book subreddit, and I had to like help design how pixelated art was going to show up next to people's names, as Flare and Etrigan and Witchboy were both characters people would choose very often, and I had no
Wow.
idea who the hell they were. But now I know. I have a little bit more context. But that's the only other time I'd heard of those names. But I was like, Etrigan is such a cool name. Why is this a character I don't know about? And then I never looked any further into it. So I'm glad this book introduced me to that. I think way back when I first read it.
Well, yeah, if you want to dig deep, go to get that original Demon series that Kirby did in I think 71. That is some wild comics. So obviously.
Gotcha. Yeah. So one other thing I did want to mention about this book that I appreciated was I like that if you're one of those Batman readers who's like, how am I supposed to read a Batman book about Batman characters without Batman in it? We did get some Batman in the form of classic flashbacks, which is something that I liked in this book. I like less in other Batman books that do this.
Okay.
For some reason, like Chang's flashbacks, I think they feel a little jarring, but they are pretty well done. And they do give you that little bits of like, what was this giant war that happened? And we can finally get Chang drawing Batman and Joker and all this other stuff. And I love the way that he depicts these characters. It's not too far-fledged from like the norm. Batman hasn't evolved into this other weirdly thing. He's just your standard Batman, and Joker is just your standard Joker. And so again, this to me adds all this plausibility and understandability to how this storyline could have progressed, because things don't feel so far-fledged from what I think is like standard continuity, I think, at the time when this came out. But I like those flashbacks. I like the way that we see some of the other characters. Chang gets like a couple moments to write a Robin. He gets a couple moments to write the Joker, in the big reveal at the end where we see why was Joker doing all this. I really liked how that all played out. And it all happens in this very nice, perfectly timed, set of flashbacks and stuff. Because I think what we could have gotten, which would have been very dissatisfying, is like a whole issue that's just all flashback, right? And instead, like, we get these nice piecemeal things. And maybe that's that thing is that I suggested is very, very uncommon. But I feel like some books do that, and it never pays off as well as having contextual flashbacks like this. So I did like that we got a little Batman, and we got a little bit of characters that I think people would have loved to have seen Chang write and draw, like the Robins and stuff before they all died. Yeah, I don't know if you guys like that or not. I guess, what were your thoughts about the flashbacks? How about that?
I found them helpful for understanding what was going on.
Oh, sure. Of course. I mean, the mystery of like, what is this war that happened, right? I think funny enough, I had just read like the War of Jokes and Riddles, so I felt like this was kind of like a nice little sidestep in like a different direction for that. But anyways, go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, I think it's essential for this type of story. If you're jumping in 10 years in the future and they keep referencing like what happened, they kind of have to show it. But again, I like the restraint that Chang has of just saying like, I'll give you just enough detail, and again, the moments you get with Batman are brief, but they're in character. That feels like Batman would do that. Batman would sacrifice himself for the city. And I think that's what the core of the story is how Selina Kyle and Harvey Dent both interpret Batman's sacrifice for Gotham and what that means to them. And it's more of their story, even though it's a Batman story, quote unquote, or a Catwoman story. Like
totally.
That to me is, when I went back and reread it, I really understood that better. It's like, of course, these two would come head to head because they both have a personal connection to Batman, deeper than other villains or the characters do. And, Dent sees that sacrifice and says, well, I'm going to continue Batman's legacy, but he understands Batman's legacy is using fear and intimidation to control Gotham. Whereas Selina Kyle says, no, I knew Bruce Wayne, I knew Batman, he loved Gotham. That's not the approach we need. So the fact that it's set in a police state, when you see these like heavily armored, security guards, police officers that look like, modified Batman, it's like, that is not what Batman's legacy is. So the fact that the story revolves around that, as a deep Batman fan, that's what makes it so engaging for me.
I really appreciated the bit about when they mentioned that Batman's money made way more of a difference to Gotham in cleaning up crime than his fighting crime physically ever did. I'm like, thank you.
Yeah.
But, that's the point that Barbara makes, right?
Yeah.
And then Selina Kyle's like, yeah, but you've turned Gotham into a police state. You gave all that money to the police. There's other ways to do it. Like, there's always the critique, but it's like, we know from real world situations that any money like a lot of governments get, instead of going to people who need it, end up going to police. So I
Right.
liked that as a social commentary,
Yeah.
especially in light of, the past few years.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think it's funny because I think Chang gets to eat or have his cake and eat it too, right? He gets to make the argument that I think everybody wants to make. Like, it's, I feel like at this point it is said in so many other stories too. But
Oh,
then
okay.
he also gets to tell like there's nothing wrong with that, right? Like, I think like you're totally right, because that is like the argument that I think everyone can and should be making, because it does make sense. But he also gets to tell a cool Batman story. He also gets to tell a really cool Catwoman story, despite all that argument being made and having happened. Because so I don't know, it makes it for a fun bit in the story.
Should just be a
But
Batman book, and the whole series is just him funding infrastructure projects and like public housing and jobs training programs and
right,
free
but it's a
healthcare.
but it's like a dummies 101 book where it's like how to be a good billionaire. It's
Yeah.
like, and then we just mail this to all the shitty humans out there. But
Yeah.
beyond that, I did want to talk about some other stuff. What were your guys' thoughts on Poison Ivy in this book? Because I love Poison Ivy. I love the way that she's introduced to this book. Like, she's just this big lovable character who right away just kind of brightens Selina's mood, which is really cool. But it did seem like every time there was a problem, it's like, don't worry, plants got it. Plants fix it. Plants will fix it. I don't know. What did you guys think of Poison Ivy in this book?
I love that they didn't make her a twig. That she is just like a normal size woman, and
Right.
that I don't know if she is gay in other books, but I appreciated that in this one. And
Well, she is
yes,
now,
that
thanks to the woke mob. No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. Cut that, Xander. Cut that.
um yeah, she kept reminding me, maybe because I just watched it like 30 times on repeat in December, of the Jolly Green Giant Muppet like Christmas Day spirit of like
Oh,
she's just
whoa,
like
Yep.
that's
so
so funny.
joyful and
Yeah,
full of ivy. And yes,
yeah,
she conveniently saves the day in the same way that Witch Boy conveniently gets him out of demon form. They're like, what are we going to do to get our friend back? And then he's like,
yeah,
aha,
yeah.
I have arrived. But it's a 4-issue
I'm
book. What do
Witch
you want,
Man.
Mike? What do you want?
No. Listen, no. I thought it was funny that like there were all these obstacles, and at no point does Selina really ask Ivy to do these things for her.
Yeah.
And this isn't me like critiquing the book. I just think it's interesting the way that it's done, where like Poison Ivy like kind of steps in and is like, I can probably fix like all of this shit, which to me is like the kind of like the way that Poison Ivy I think has been portrayed, at least in the media that I've consumed recently, where like whenever she shows up, she's like kind of got everything on lock. Like the fact that every time Poison Ivy is able to just do everything is a really interesting thing, but she chooses not to unless she has to, which I kind of
Right.
think speaks to her like villainous nature, and that like, yeah, she could fix all these problems and she just hasn't. But in this book, she's doing all of this positive and like good work on the backs of like using her powers to grow coffee for people that funds everything. And then on top of that, she goes and she helps Selina, and she kind of helps her solve her problems and stuff. And like, but at no point does Selina look to Poison Ivy and say, I need you to do all this for me. Right.
Right.
I don't know. I just think it's an interesting thing. I'm not really sure if there's a point to be made there. I just found it interesting.
Well, it's like, the idea of Poison Ivy, instead of being portrayed as this sort of villain, it's like, she is Gaia. She's part of the earth. Like, she's
Yeah.
basically like
Right.
this sort of like elemental in a way of like, and being nourishing and like growth, and like the way that that's sort of implied, even in the way that she's drawn, is just kind of that's, I think, a really interesting take on the character, one I did not expect when I started the book.
Yeah. Yeah, there's like we've said, there's been some pretty cool takes on these characters that have like aged up, right? Like Selina, looks like an older woman, and she acts like an older woman. She's got knee problems like an older woman, and like that like feels so nice. Like Kate said earlier, like to have a character or have a story about a character like this. But then we also see how these other characters grew up, right? We see how the Riddler grew up. We see how, and I say grew up in like a weird way, but like how they've aged. Like Poison Ivy becomes this, like Paul said, like more motherly, like druidic figure. Whereas the Riddler has just kind of become like a guy. He's like, I gotta do right by my daughter. Like that's it. Like
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I
Mm-hmm.
like these evolved portrayals of these characters. But the fact that they can still come back and, you know, get back to doing the supervillain business and be corny and make these corny jokes. Like there was a moment near the end where like Riddler and Ivy are just kind of like making bits about, oh, there should be a Robin here. You know, like
Right. Yep.
I don't know. I found that to be all really, really charming. Again, this is why I think this book works, right? Try to wrap things up here, unless you guys have some other points to make. But like, this is why I think this book works. It gets to do all of the things that make DC Comics great, while also telling a story about like older adults and how they cope with the changing world around them, and how even, you know, even when they try to bring back some of their older stuff, it can work, but it doesn't always work, and they can adapt. It's almost like a very optimistic look at the way that people grow. As the world changes around them, that they can still be the best at what they are, even if the world has changed the game in what they used to do. So I kind of like the way that this book kind of looks at all of that.
I like that they made Catwoman not grow into a maternal person that would be kind of unbelievable, right? But like that's so often what you get when you do get older women in comics. They're always the maternal type and training the next and being that kind of thing. And she's not at all. She explicitly isn't. Like they show her being asked and trying to help, and she's just like, yeah, that's not me. And
Right.
but the thing I wanted to hit on before we close was like, what do we think this whole pool meant? Like what is Chang trying to say with that? Like, because to me, it, as like a non-DC person, it kind of came off like he was saying like Batman had like no life other than fighting crime. Like on his deathbed, what he wanted to do was fight more villains, and
Right.
had no other thought than that. And kind of putting that in front of Catwoman as she's trying to forge her new life now that she's out of prison, and being like, do you want this? Is this what you this you? Like look in the mirror, this you?
Right.
And her kind of looking at that and being like, I don't know, I have all these like people I've reconnected with and that I care about, and maybe I don't want this. But then that ending where she gets asked by Barbara Gordon to, you know, be a crook for her, and she says yes. Like I don't know what we were taking from this. What do you guys think?
You know, yeah, I think you can read that ending in a couple different ways, because we don't get a definitive answer from Selena really saying like I will do that, you know what I mean?
Right.
But we also right before that get a scene where it appears as though she's basically, whether explicitly trained her or not, kind of passed on the Catwoman gimmick to the Riddler's daughter. Like she's running around with like a cat mask on, you know, like, so it's like the idea is the future of Gotham belongs to the people, not to the idea of Batman in a way.
Yeah.
That's kind of how I read that. And again, like I hinted at earlier, this idea that the dueling legacies that of Batman that we get here, it's like, you know, Batman having basically a Lazarus pit or the Orpheus pit in the Batcave. He can come back as a guy. I can come back. I can continue my mission. And like, it's almost like Selena almost like letting Bruce rest. You know what I mean? Just saying like, no, we have it. You know, and I think that's always been something that I've really liked. I love any Batman story that hints at the idea that Batman's never fought alone. He's always had Alfred. He's always had a Robin. He's always had, you know, Jim Gordon. He's never done this alone. So now we get a point where he's gone. Those people that he inspired are carrying on his legacy in the positive way, you know, after, you know, Two-Face is arrested for, you know, at the end of the story. So, you know, as someone who thinks a lot about the idea of Batman and what it means, I think Chang kind of like really nails it there. It's like it becomes less about fear and control and becomes more about hope in the future and what Gotham can be. So I think that's how I read the ending. At the end, the very last page, when Selena Kyle and Barbara Gordon are looking at the skyline, and early in the story, Selena had mentioned how she hates all the new architecture. She's looking at the skyline, all the buildings are lit up, and she's like, oh, they look like jewels. And it's like she is willing to accept the future of Gotham. She's let the past go. So that's how I read it.
Oh, I read that as they look like targets to me as a jewel thief.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting because I saw the Orpheus pit as Selena saying that I don't need Batman to do this, right? When she turns away from it, I think she also kind of this is also her going like, oh, I was really in love with a simple man, like in a lot of ways, right? Because
Yeah.
he couldn't give up the fight, right? And that is
Right.
to her, I think, the most depressing thing, that like he didn't have some master plan, some other thing, whatever. His plan was just bring me back and I'll do it, which is like the most selfish thing, right? He doesn't trust anybody to actually complete
Sure.
what he wanted to do, right? And I think that was her saying like, I'm not going to honor this. Obviously she couldn't, but I think like she at that point saying like, no, we've got this. We don't need Batman to do what Batman wanted to do, you know? And then, you know, everything else Paul said, I completely agree with as well. So, I thought that was an interesting thing. I thought it was like an absurd thing that like he brought Alfred back and didn't take away from like this extreme heartbreak that like, oh no, but I can use this. It's like, God, you're fucking heartless, dude.
Yeah.
But so it was interesting, you know, interesting ending. I like your interpretation of it, I think is kind of the same feeling that I got of her saying like, oh no, I like the way that this looks now. I like that this city is now a shining thing to me, that I can covet, right? I can covet what this city has become. I think I think Paul, you kind of nailed it on the head there. But Kate, I guess your interpretation was she was like, I'm robbing all these fuckers.
Exactly. Why would they call them jewels if it wasn't because of that?
Right. No, I get you. I think that's a good read on it as well. Who knows? Maybe Catwoman did go on. But yeah, I think the last thing I'll say here is, did you guys get a chance to look at the cover gallery at the back of this book? Because I read the like digital edition of the collection, which came with all these beautiful covers. Like there's one of Killer Croc and the gang playing video games. That is just super fun. And there's a beautiful one of the aged Poison Ivy that's very nice. A wonderful color work. I mean, like, I don't know, this book is just fantastic. It's so gorgeous. But yeah, I don't know, it's really fun. And Paul, I'm guessing if you bought the single issues, you've probably got a lot of those covers already yourself.
I just always got the standard Cliff Chang covers. Just the newsstand covers. I'm not a variant cover person, which is maybe why I need to buy the hardcover so I can get have copies of them. But I did appreciate it. So I didn't pull out the single issues. I ended up reading it digitally as well. And we got the nice little, in addition to the covers, we got the sort of character design sketches that Chang did, which again reminded me of just how good he is at drawing clothes and fashion on people. Because it looks like it's like you're watching Project Runway. It's like, I'm going to do this. It's like, oh yeah, that's how clothes look. That's how fabrics work when they move. And it's just amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that Catwoman leotard with the like onesie that she wears with the sweatshirt is like one of the coolest looks ever. Right. Like what a cool superhero figure thing with like there's also a variant with the cloak that I'm like, that's so cool. Anyway, sorry, Kate, what were you saying?
But and then he also has the commentary on her past outfits when people are talking about the posters they had of her and she's like judging them based on that. So good. But no, I read the single digital issues off the DC app and it did not have those.
Okay. Well, we'll have to find those other pages and show them off to you. But I think to wrap things up, this is an awesome pick. I will say, like, I'm really glad to have gone back and revisited this book because, like,
I really
not only does this book rule, it's like it's a reminder that there's some really, really good standalone DC graphic novels that I think, like Kate, you were saying, like, you're not fully plugged into the DC universe. Really, all you got to know is like, who's Batman? Who's Catwoman? Who's the Joker? Who's Two-Face? Like things that I think are pretty common knowledge if you've been in comic books at least a little bit, and you can have a really, really, really good time with this book. So I really want to shout out all the folks on Goodreads for picking this book because it really, really ruled, and I'm excited that you folks came together and finished our reading challenge. So thanks for that. Any last comments from you guys, I guess, before I really get into my thing? Kate, any last comments from you?
No.
Okay. How about you, Paul?
I know I already mentioned the Etrigan and Clarion Witch Boy fight is my favorite moment, but honestly, there's a 3-panel little sequence when we find out why they had to bring Etrigan is because Bruce had hired Zatanna to cast a spell on the Batcave so no one could break in. And of course, once Etrigan says "Open Sesame" backwards, you get a brief glimpse of Zatanna being like dazed, like, "Oh, what happened?" Like she's on stage performing in her magic show, and she's like, she makes a joke like, "Oh, I had too many martinis for the show." It's like, "Oh no, someone undid her magic." And it's like a little moment like that as a deep DC, like especially DC Magic characters fan. I loved it so much. So yeah, again, I think what works is the attention to detail, and also a book that appeals to people that don't know that stuff. It's kind of like the perfect medium for all that stuff. That's why, again, why I praise this book.
See, Paul, you're so close to getting in all this high fantasy bullshit. We just got to find a way. I'm working on it. That's my 2024 goal. Well, to wrap up the show here, I want to say check us out on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Discord. We got all the places linked in our show notes. Make sure to check that out. Please, please, please fill out the IRCB listener survey. We really appreciate your feedback. Really want to know what you think of the show, what we can do, what you love, what you don't love, how we can improve. As always, we really, really appreciate it. And I really want to give as many $25 gift cards to legitimate human beings as I can. You can follow us on Patreon at patreon.com/IRCB podcast to get access to the IRCB Movie Club, the book versus book series, Saga of Saga. We're doing a new volume of that because the newest volume just came out. We've got so many other cool things on there. A better Batmobile, as Paul mentioned earlier. Next week's show, it's going to be me and Zach with a special guest, Ari Gross, talking comics and their newest Kickstarter, Warden's #1. Infinity Shred is the best band in the universe. They do all of our music, and they just had a new EP come out. I got the vinyl sitting here on my chair behind me. It's a beautiful re-rendition of some of their older tracks that went back to just like re-record them, and they sound fantastic. If you haven't listened to them, go check them out on Spotify or Bandcamp, wherever you like to listen to music. Xander had a feeling that you'd be here this late in the credits. He's got a cup of tea ready just for you. I want to say thank you to Paul and Kate for this episode. Thank you to Brian for proof listening. If you're on Discord and you're listening live, thank you. You're a fantastic human being. If you got this far in the episode, we love you and we can't appreciate you enough. But until next time, comics are good, and so are you.